Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is the podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Of the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am still your host, Sarah. I have not morphed into another person. Not yet. Could happen. We'll see. Thank you, as always, for joining me. I hope you're having a good day so far. We have some good news in our family, in that my parents just let me know that they are both scheduled for their first COVID vaccine in very shortly. So excited about that. Looking forward to that first step in our family being taken care of, and then hopefully at some point the rest of us will get it and I can actually go home and see everybody and hug everybody. I've been having dreams about hugging people. Maybe I've mentioned that already in the podcast, but I continue to have dreams about hugging people. Yes, I miss people. I miss interacting with people. I'm a total introvert, but I've noticed that I am starting to miss people more than I thought that I might, and definitely missing my family. So, speaking of family, it's a bit of a segue, maybe a stretch, but the book that I'm talking about today is inspired by a family story, and that book is Copy Girl. It is by author Shelley Blanton-Stroud. Did I say Copy Girl? It's called Copy Boy. Let's get the name of the book right. It's called Copy Boy, and the back of the book says she's a very brave boy and a very difficult girl. Not my fault, Jane thinks, dropping a bloody crowbar in the ditch after Daddy. She steals Mama's Ford and escapes to San Francisco, where she fakes her way into work as a newspaper copy boy. Everything's looking up until Daddy reappears on the paper's front page in a picture that threatens to reveal Jane's new identity and upend the life she's inventing. That is the description on the back of Copy Boy by Shelley Blanton-Stroud. It is historical fiction. It takes place during the Depression, and it is a story of assumed identity, of figuring out who you are, even when you're pretending to be someone else. There is a little mystery. There's a little intrigue. There is, a lot of that. I mean, it's not Shakespearean in that, there's always someone pretending to be a girl who's a boy or a boy who's a girl, all played by men, weirdly, in the originals. But it's not Shakespearean. But it is a young woman who is attempting to pass as a young man in order to have this job as a copy boy in the newspaper industry, and learning the ropes and figuring things out as she goes. She's left her family and she's on her own in San Francisco. And then, of course, as you can see, her father reemerges on the scene and threatens to disrupt everything that she has worked for. So lots of good stuff in this book, and I like that it is based on something from the author's family's experiences. It's not autobiographical. It's not a memoir in any way, but it was inspired by a story that her father told her, an experience that her father had. And so she talks about that in the interview. So I think we should definitely get started with that interview. Again, the book is called Copy Boy. The author is Shelley Blanton-Stroud. So let's go ahead and get to that interview. Hi, Shelley. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I'm so happy to be here.
I am happy to have you here. We will be discussing your novel. It's called Copy Boy. Before we get to the book, if you could share a little bit about yourself, that would be wonderful.
Oh, I would love to. Well, I can talk about my most recent life and maybe later talk about earlier days, but I have taught university writing for 34 years, 24 of them at Sacramento State. And Monday is my retirement day. So you are hitting me
so
at
exciting.
Yeah. So you are hitting me at an auspicious moment because all that teaching is over, though it's a weekend full of grading. And then I'll be finished on Monday. But during that time also, I've raised a family. I have 2 sons and a husband. And I've run a consulting business advising writers in the field of energy economics, how to write in a plainer style. That's kind of a long story. But I've only been writing fiction for 10 years. And yet I have a very deep history of book clubs. I spent 10 years running adult and teen book clubs for the Sacramento Public Library. So that book club experience was a large part of why I shifted to writing fiction, because, I've always been a reader, and I like few things more than talking to other people about books. And it was like a 10-year period of time when I thought a lot about what makes a book interesting to me, not only pleasurable to read, but also interesting to linger on. So it was kind of like an early education in what kind of book I would want to write.
Oh, that's so fun. And you mentioned the library. I love the library. I'm always, my dad's a retired librarian, so I'm always talking about libraries and my love for them. And I've been sad at the lack of being able to go to the library much this year.
I know. Oh gosh, libraries have always loomed large for me. When I was a girl, my father was the superintendent of schools for a country school district in which every school was in one campus, kindergarten through high school. And on the weekends, he would get us out of our mother's hair by taking us to that campus while he did work on the weekends. And my brother would ride his bike up and down the hallways, but my dad would let me in the library so I could spend a whole day on the weekend in a library where no one else was, taking down whatever books I wanted. And so that is like firmly in there for me, that love of libraries that seems like associated with freedom and independence too somehow.
I love that. And I actually went K through 12 in one building, so I understand the.
Oh wow!
Yeah.
Was that local? Was that near where you are now?
No, I grew up in Montana.
Oh wow!
So elementary school on one side of the cafeteria, junior high and high school on the other side of the cafeteria.
That's right. That's what this is too.
Nice. Oh, that's fun. I love it. Well, let's go ahead and talk about the book. It is, as I said, called Copy Boy. Can you give an overview of the story?
Yeah, definitely. Well, Copy Boy is a historical thriller, and it's set in 1937. Its main character is a girl, a 17-year-old girl, Jane, who begins the story in a Sacramento Hooverville camp for homeless farm workers. After having a big fight with her father, she escapes to San Francisco, where she kind of reinvents herself as a boy, in fact, a copy boy for the Prospect newspaper, because she's hiding from a crime that she may or may not have committed. So everything is going well for her in San Francisco, having totally reinvented herself as a copy boy, when her father's photograph appears on the front page of her paper. And that's where kind of the mystery thriller part ensues.
Yeah, so you've got, actually, I love that there's a couple of different things going on, because you've got the mystery thriller part, but then you've also got this great story of a young woman trying to reinvent herself, and doing so by actually, pretending to be a boy so that she can work in this male-dominated field. And
right.
I love that. What was your inspiration for the book?
Well, gosh, maybe this is why it took me 10 years to write the book. I mean, first of all, I think it's pretty typical for a first novel to take 10 years of gestation and learning, the learning curve. But also for me, it's related to the way I think, where I have so many elements that I want to explore in the book. And it took me long to distill what was core to it. And so its inspiration, if I distill its first inspiration, it would really go back to my father's family experience. Both my parents were Dust Bowl immigrants to California, to Wasco, California, and Bakersfield, California. And my mother's family from Oklahoma, and my father's from Texas. And as a girl, I was always so fascinated by the stories my parents would tell about their memories of, escaping the Dust Bowl and living in California in those days. And in particular, my mother's family, she was an only child, and her father was able to get a position as a foreman on a farm when he arrived. And then he became a farmer, a successful farmer in Wasco, California. But my dad was one of 10 kids, and their experience was very different. They wound up living in a Hooverville camp, much like my main character Jane does, a homeless camp where people would live while trying to get work in the field. And so that general background was part of the inspiration. But very literally, my father told a story about when he was 12 years old that became the inspiration for sort of the inciting incident and the beginning of my novel. I don't know, is this a good time for me to tell you that story?
That would be great. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, good. Well, first I'll say what happens in the beginning of my novel didn't happen fully to my father. I don't want you to get the impression he's a criminal. But
good to know.
Yeah. When he was 12, they were living in a tent, and they were doing picking of cotton before, or it might have been I don't remember if it's cotton or potatoes at that point, but they would do that before school and they would do it after school. All the kids would do it, and the parents. And there were so many kids in his family that that living in a tent, it meant that all the kids slept on one mattress. And so my dad did not want to sleep like that because, if somebody wet the bed, then you'd have to get up in the morning and go out to the fields and then straight to school smelling like urine. So he would choose instead to sleep outside. He'd prefer to sleep outside in the dirt. So one night he was out there with his good friend who lived in the family tent next to theirs. And we'll just call him Buddy. That's not really his name, but they were outside playing marbles. And Buddy's mother came out of their tent and said, I need y'all to get rid of Daddy. And get rid of Daddy. And Buddy looked immediately stricken. My dad and Buddy were 12. So get rid of your daddy. Well, Buddy's dad was an alcoholic. And he was actually a loving, friendly, charismatic, sort of delightful person. But he also was an alcoholic whose illness meant that he couldn't provide for his family. He wouldn't work the way he should work. When the family worked and earned money, he would use that money on alcohol and going off on benders. And times were so difficult then. I mean, it was really a very impoverished time. And the mother just couldn't take it anymore. So she tells the two boys, I need you to get rid of Daddy. He was passed out in the tent. Well, Buddy started to fall apart when his mom said that. And my dad got up and followed Buddy's mother into the tent and saw Buddy's dad. And he said to Buddy, you get his feet, I'll get under his arms. And to his deep surprise, Buddy did what he said. So they carried Buddy's dad to the back seat of Buddy's mother and father's car, and she said, drive on down to Shafter and get rid of him by the side of the road. So that'd be about 12 miles away. These boys were 12 years old. They didn't know how to drive. I mean, they maybe had experimented a little with driving, and they'd certainly watched parents do it avidly, and maybe had some experience with tractors and like, but it's not like they were confident drivers. So I need you to drop him at the side of the road in Shafter, she said. And so at that time, it was clear that Buddy wasn't going to be able to do it. So my dad got in the driver's seat and Buddy in the passengers, and he got that old clunker down the road to Shafter with Buddy sobbing and accusing him. And then Buddy's father in the back seat woke up and was begging him, don't do this, don't do this. But my dad said he knew that Buddy's mom said, she'd said, we ain't going to make it if you don't do this. So he did what she said. When they got to Shafter, he got out of the car and pulled Buddy's dad out and left him by the side of the road. Got back in the car and drove himself and Buddy back to the camp. And when he woke up the next morning, Buddy's tent was gone, Buddy's car was gone, Buddy and his mama were gone. Just trash was left where they were. And he never saw his best friend again. About 5 years ago, when it was the 75th anniversary of Grapes of Wrath, a novel by John Steinbeck, and NPR and the John Steinbeck, the National Center for the Study of John Steinbeck, hosted this migration from where the Joad family started all the way to Bakersfield, where they ended in the novel. They sent a playwright and an artist and a filmmaker on this route, interviewing people along the way. And when they ended in Bakersfield, they had an event held at Cal State Bakersfield, and they asked my dad up on stage to be interviewed by an oral historian, so that to demonstrate what it's like to take these oral histories. And this was the story that my father told, and he said, "You can't know me without knowing I did this when I was 12 years old." And that had been a story that I'd always heard growing up. My dad always told me that story, but I don't know how much he talked about it publicly. But he felt at that point in life that he needed to say it out loud to other people. And I was sitting there. I'd been, I spent about 5 years really working on being a writer, learning how to write at that point, how to write fiction. And I saw the playwright sitting in the front row of this event, scribbling like crazy as my dad talked. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is my family's origin story. I can't let him be the first person to tell it. So that was kind of like the literal inspiration to get to work seriously on writing my novel, because I knew this is where it begins. And I didn't know exactly what would happen coming out of it, but I knew that was the inspiration and I needed to get it done.
Wow.
I think wow is definitely accurate. It's still accurate now, listening to this, as it was when I was listening to Shelley tell that story in the first place. And I think wow is a good place to break and go to our first break of the podcast. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
GSMC Beauty Tips Podcast gives you advice on everything from hair to fashion to skincare products. We'll talk about the latest trends in makeup, hairstyles, and anti-aging remedies. And we'll cover all of the newest fashion trends. If you have an interest in or questions about the beauty trends that might work best for you, the Golden State Media Concepts Beauty Tips Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Beauty Tips Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
GSMC Book Review Podcast and my interview with author Shelley Blanton-Stroud. Before the break, Shelley was telling the story of the inspiration behind her novel Copy Boy, and I so very eloquently responded with, wow. And we're going to pick up right there because pretty sure I followed that up with a second wow. So let's get back to the interview.
Wow. That is quite the story. I mean, I can't even imagine being 12 and having something like that, and then trying to live with that event, and losing your best friend, and there's just so much in there.
Well, that's part of what I mean. Even though I fictionalized and changed it radically for my purposes in the novel, the truth is I was inspired even more than the actual event. I was inspired by the spirit of it, like the questions it raises. That have always been things I've thought about, like, what is it? I mean, my dad will talk about grit. He wound up being the Kern County Superintendent of Schools, and he opened an internet company with my brother. He's had all kinds of life adventures and accomplishments. And he will often tell you it's because he has grit, that he worked as hard as he needed to do, that he was willing to do the hard things that other people were less willing to do. And I've always been fascinated by that because I've always wondered, but what do you lose when you're a child who's asked to do hard things you should never be asked to do? What part of your childhood gets stripped away? And what do you gain? So that was a big part of it. And it's something it's interesting too to me because having taught for so many decades, taught at Sacramento State, it's been a research topic in my writing classes where I ask them to research grit and to find out what the science says about it and to explore what it might mean, just because I can't get enough of learning about that topic. I don't think I've worked it all out in Copy Boy for sure, but it's what really is one of the things that really got me stuck in writing it.
Thank you. That is really fascinating. So let's talk then a little bit more about the book itself. Can you talk about the main character, Jane, and what about her do you think will resonate with readers?
Yeah, and I think, gosh, I've been learning so much in the process of writing this book and then seeing it out in the world and talking to people about it because different people get different things. Some people really are in there for a thriller. And I love thrillers too. But other people, maybe they're interested in historical elements. And other people are very interested in Jane's role as a girl. She's 17 when it begins. And the thing, I can't say what other people will feel about her. They'll feel she's a difficult girl. But for me, she has this core flaw in the time that she's living in 1937, and that is that she's terribly ambitious. Jane is ambitious, and sometimes her ambition is bad, or it leads to bad things. It leads her to jump when maybe she should pause. And I know I'm not like Jane. I am so careful. It takes me forever to decide to do a thing. So I'm fascinated by her and a little envious of that, whatever it is in a girl like her that says, I know they think I can't do it, but I'm going to do it. So it's her ambition and how she learns to shape it and maybe modify it that I think is really interesting about her. And the other part of it is, I mean, just the element that she is a girl in a time even more stringent than ours in terms of what it is a girl is allowed to do. There are, she discovers a certain freedom and a greater instinct to achieve things when she puts on the doggone pants. Wearing pants changes things for Jane. Cutting off her hair and not worrying about her hair. All of a sudden, there's a list of things she doesn't have to worry about, opening up space to worry about things she cares more about. And so I think that might be of interest to some readers. Actually, one of the things that interests me about Jane is that I didn't know, I thought that by writing this novel that would scratch this itch of wanting to look at family history and all of that and my feelings about female ambition. But I realize now that Jane, this is going to be a shorter series because I'm really, really interested in watching how Jane as a female progresses in her life. I have in mind, and in fact, it's no great surprise in the book that she's going to wind up being very successful. But I'm very interested in seeing how she progresses. What happens to her along the way as an ambitious female when she confronts real obstacles? So the follow-on books will move her through time and in different ages, because I'm very interested in female characters who change and respond to experience to become who they ought to be.
Yeah, and you get a little glimpse of that change at the end of the book, and I don't want to give anything away, but and I was actually kind of fascinated by that because you're like, okay, so you've got this 17-year-old girl, very ambitious, very stubborn, very she knows what she wants, but then how does she get from there to what she is, who she is at the end? So that's exciting.
Thank you.
I was going to ask you, what drew you to this particular time in history, but that comes from your dad's story. How much research did you do for the book?
Yeah, it's funny, in this workshop that I was leading last week, I was talking about research and what we call research. You know what I mean? Is it just literally when you're in the library? Is it all the books that you read and highlight and take notes? Is it the conversations you have with family? I mean, there have been, it's hard to accurately describe the amount of research because a lifetime of conversations is part of the research. However, there is literal research too. One of the areas that I did a lot of work in that made a huge difference in the book was, well, actually, first I'll say there is a book called The WPA Guide to the 1930s in San Francisco, which was like a lifesaver. It was like literally written during that time period. The funds for it came from government to give writers work, and really strong writers wrote it. And it's everything. It's like, how much does it cost to take a bus from here to here? Where are the bus routes? What are the 10 most popular bars? Who were the people who were presidents of these different big companies there at that time? It was just like this incredible, almost inexhaustible source. So that book is so, dog-eared for me. But an area of research that made a huge difference was I'd always been interested, because of my family's background, in the photographer, the documentary photographer, Dorothea Lange, who was, I don't know if you're familiar with her famous photograph called Migrant Mother Nipomo, but if you look up Migrant Mother Nipomo online, you'll just see, millions of references to it as Dorothea Lange, who worked for the federal government, went around taking pictures during the Depression as part of an attempt to report on what the actual conditions were. And also the people who ran her agency, the FSA, were interested in generating empathy for the people who are living by the side of the road in order to get them more government help. And so Dorothea Lange took this photograph, Migrant Mother, that wound up on front pages all around the country, and it led literally to 20,000 pounds of food being delivered to the camp where a migrant mother was taken. And it kind of alerted people across the country to just how desperate things were in this element of the Depression. So I've always loved Dorothea Lange's photographs. They're so, I guess part of it is that not only are they beautiful and artistic and the composition is so fantastic, but they were like elevating the experience of my people. I felt that she was taking people who lived in cars and tents along the side of the road on that migration from Texas and Oklahoma with hopes for the future in California. And she gave them dignity in those photographs. So I always followed her works and collected all of these books with her photographs. And then when I read a Linda Gordon biography of it, then I knew I had to put her in the novel, a fictionalized version of Dorothea Lange, because I would never say Dorothea Lange does what my character Greta does. But Greta was definitely inspired by my research into Dorothea Lange. In fact, I can tell you one thing about that,
Okay.
two things about that. One would be that in that biography, I learned that Dorothea Lange made a minor alteration to that photograph, Migrant Mother, in which she edited out, or had someone in her darkroom edit out the thumb of the woman in the photograph, Jessie Owens Thompson, because Dorothea Lange thought that thumb was really distracting and ruined the composition. And when she did that, she got in so much trouble from a government agency because they took very, very seriously the documentary nature of their work. They had kind of a pure idea about show only what is truly happening. So the idea that she would modify it got her in a lot of trouble. And when I learned about that, I became really fascinated because of the time that we're living in on this topic of fake news and the difference between accuracy and truth. And I didn't wind up feeling wholly one way or another. I know that in my novel, the character Greta manipulates things, and by that manipulation, she does some good, just like Dorothea Lange did. Of course, in the novel, other things happen too, but I was really interested in the truth versus accuracy theme that came up in history for documentary photographers and even documentary writers in that period.
I looked up the picture while we were talking, and it is, I'm sure most people would recognize it. I'm not as familiar with the other pictures in that series. And I just came across the thumb. I was like, I've never,
right?
I don't know what you're talking about. What thumb? And you have to, you have to really search because it is not in most of the pictures. And and also the process of removing a thumb from 1930s film, that's a different process than what we have now.
Yeah, right. And also, it almost strikes me as charming that could get her in so much trouble, compared to the kinds of things that might be happening now.
And accuracy, they wanted accuracy, but it's literally just a thumb. I mean,
Yes,
I don't know how to.
right.
It almost looks disembodied because you don't see the person that it's attached to. You don't even see the hand that
Yeah.
it's attached to.
And that's part of why she
So-
wanted to remove it, because it was kind of clunky and just made the composition a little odd.
Yeah. Oh, fascinating. All the things that I'm learning today from you. There are obviously, some autobiographical elements in the book. Would you say there's much of you in Jane?
I'm not like Jane. Like I said before, that I'm a comfortable person. I don't have a long history of putting myself out on the edge, of jumping over the gorge the way that Jane does. I admire people like that, but they make me uncomfortable. And so I think if the question is, does she represent me? I think she represents some kind of shadow in me, like another version of who I might have been if I'd been more daring and nervy. And probably one of the nerviest things I've ever done is to actually write this book, because I'm someone who has sort of longed to do this for a while. And, I'm sure many of your guests will talk about how you've got to be a little bit brave to write, not to write necessarily, but to share what you're writing and to imply that it's worth someone reading, and that, I feel like that was the biggest risk I've ever taken, was to say to readers, I think you will find this interesting. I think you'll be intrigued by people making these choices. But Jane, she makes 10 decisions like that in a week, So I think it wasn't reflecting who I am as much as who I'd like to be a little bit more like. I do think in the book, if I were recognizing myself anywhere, it might be in, again, a shadow character who doesn't really get on the screen with us. She just appears in memories. I think I'm closer to Jane's granny, who was like my granny. I'm someone who I've spent most of my life in support of other people trying to meet their dreams. I'm a parent, and people who are full-on parents, largely orient themselves around that, like making life possible for their children. And as a teacher all these years, it's been about encouraging and nudging along my writing students. In fact, that works out as a theme, and that's who the granny character is, someone who keeps her hope in herself alive. But that is another thing that came out of the Dorothea Lange research and was an important part to me, maybe less important to other readers. But the thing about parents and children, and what you owe to, what do parents owe to you? I was thinking about when, in my research, I turned up that Dorothea Lange, in order to have this brilliant career as an artist who literally made the world better for people who were struggling with her photographs, in order for her to do that, she and her husband, who was an economics professor at UC Berkeley, they would travel the roads, and for quite a while, they spent a lot of time on the road. And Dorothea would take these photographs and talk to the people, and her husband would document things, the economic situation, and they did much work together. Well, in order to do that, she had to arrange for her children to be in sort of temporary foster care. So very often, if they were going to go out for a work trip for a month, she would put her children in foster care for a month. And then when they'd come back, and then the children would go out to foster care again. And when I learned that, even though oh my gosh, I adore Dorothea Lange. She's one of these inspirational figures to me. It really gets in there for me. It's really a piece of grit that I can't quite digest, that doing that made it possible for her to do this world-changing work. But I'm telling you, her kids don't think that was so great. Was that best for them? You know? And there's a bit in the book where Greta talks to Jane about this, that maybe it is good for children to have the experience of making do for themselves, not expecting their parents to do everything for them. And Jane's wrestling with that because she's got real problems with her parents. And ultimately, is she better off because she's had that independence? I mean, it gets back to my story about my dad. Is he better off because as a kid, he had unreasonable difficulties? He had to climb over barriers that I don't think he should have. But is he better off because of that? I'm not sure. So that is like a topic for me in there. Because, you know, I've tended to always think that we're all better off if we have the experience of feeling secure and cared for and safe in family life, so we can go out and take risks independently. But this kind of raises the question about whether or not that's true. And it also raises another question that if Dorothea Lange were a man, perhaps she would never have had to make such a choice. There would have been a nanny for her, you know, or a wife to stay home. So, so Granny, even though Granny does not take up much page space at all, she's just a memory in a couple of places. She means something to me, and I feel connected to her because she reminds me of one of my grannies, and because I've always kind of wanted to be the parent figure who makes other people feel like they can really do something.
So there you go, a little history with your historical fiction, some maybe before known facts about Dorothea Lange. I realize that I don't know that much about her, so it was interesting to learn more. We're going to talk a little bit more about her and the situation with her children and her life, etc., when we come back. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
GSMC Book Review Podcast. Before the break, Shelley was speaking about Dorothea Lange and her leaving her children for extended periods of time when she would go off with her husband to work, and I am fascinated by that and the implications of that. So let's go ahead and get back to the interview with Shelley.
I am very curious now what the children of Dorothea Lange actually thought about all of that. I mean, it's one thing to leave them with like family, but to actually put them in some version of foster care, and we've all heard horror stories about foster care. I mean, wow.
Well, foster care, I guess, was different. It wasn't like a government agency type thing. I think it was a for hire kind of deal. you know,
Right,
you could
right.
find a family. But I have read some things from like grandchildren and so on. You know, it wasn't great for them. It's not like her heirs are going about saying terrible things about her. They're not, you know. However, you definitely get the impression from reading the biographical information that this was an element of growing up in that family. You know, and I mean, there were so many, when you asked about research before, there were so many elements of it of real life that I so wanted to be in this, but there were too many things, like that Dorothea's first husband, Maynard Dixon, the important California painter, had a daughter from a previous marriage who did not, you know, who came into Dorothea's marriage, and she was never she was never nurtured the way she ought to have been, and for a long time she inspired a character in the book because I worried about that girl. And from what I've read, you know, not great things happened to her. But ultimately, I had to face the fact that she didn't belong in this particular story, you know. You know what? I'll tell you something I think is interesting is that one time I heard the writer, the novelist Amy Tan give a lecture, and she said that that every writer has an origin story, something that happened in their life that reverberates for them. And in her case, it was that when she was a young girl, her mother had a mental illness, and I don't know exactly what that illness was. But at one point when she was like a 12-year-old girl, her mother pushed her up against the wall and held a knife to her throat and basically said, I can take you out whenever I want to. And Amy Tan said, that is a scene in every book I write. Not literally. It is not literally always going to be true that someone holds a knife against a vulnerable person's throat. But the emotions at the core of that, the questions at the core of that will always be in what she writes. And I think that's true, that there are things you uncover in research and in your own experience that even if you can't work them into the plot, you know that they're touching on themes and questions that you'll keep returning to. So I think the vulnerability of children and the obligation of parents is really going to be a theme that goes on in this series.
Yeah, I can only imagine that there is. I mean, I don't know the numbers, but the percentage of research that actually ends up in a book has got to be microscopic compared to the amount of research that happens. So are you working on the next book in the series currently, or what does that timeline look like?
I am working on that, and I'm hoping to finish that draft by June. And this one's going to take place originally, you know, Sarah, I thought that this series was going to jump in big chunks of time, like from 1937 to maybe 47 to 57 to 67, and let Jane get old relatively quickly. But now I find that I couldn't make myself jump ahead so much because there are so many things that would happen to Jane as a 20 or 21-year-old woman that will make a difference in what kind of old woman she'll become. So this book is going to be set in 1939. And this is interesting to me because originally I have 318 pages of a novel written about a world-class tennis player, a contemporary novel. And I just can't let that be the next book because everything that's happened with the pandemic has like changed what I think real contemporary life is. And so it doesn't really work for me to talk about it in that way in the current times. But I was still so disappointed because I've done so much work in researching women athletes and their ambition and the role ambition plays in it. so one of the women who invited me to her book club gave me the best lead that has just changed everything. Her name is Carolyn Martin, and she told me to look into Alice Marble. And Alice Marble in 1939 was a world-class, international champion of tennis. And she was in San Francisco. She grew up in San Francisco, where Jane is going to live. And Alice Marble is this amazing person who she plays in 1939 at Wimbledon, in the last Wimbledon before World War II. She won. And she also won in the mixed doubles with a partner, Bobby Riggs, young, like teenage Bobby Riggs. So I thought that was interesting. But Alice Marble goes on to have this amazing career in life, including that she was an editor of and designer of the costume of Wonder Woman in the comic strip. And then she also became a spy in World War II. So I knew that I wasn't going to give up Jane as my protagonist. So in this novel set in 1939, Alice Marble's fictionalized self will be a major character, and as will the fictionalized version of her tennis coach. And it's going to kind of begin at Wimbledon in 1939. And so it was such a gift when this book club friend recommended Alice Marble to me, because where I had been feeling all of this pain and stress about writing the next book, now it's just all joy. I mean, oh my gosh, it's so much fun doing this research, and I still get to follow that thread of female ambition, female grit, the kinds of choices you have to make. It's just that I get to continue it in a historical period.
Just showing that you never quite know where inspiration might come from.
Absolutely. And this has been a topic. Last week I did a workshop, and one of our topics of discussion was, how do you work out ideas? And there are some people who will say, reading and then just thinking. One guy I talked to, he just stares at the ceiling, and so everyone around him just thinks he's goofing off all the time, but he feels like he's doing the work of thinking. Whereas another guy in that group was talking about how he's got to talk. He has to talk. From conversation is where the breakthroughs take place. And I think for me, part of why it takes me a while to get something done like this is that there's multiple layers. There's all this reading, and then in conversation, it tears down walls. And all of a sudden, you see something of you that you couldn't have seen before, provoked by a talk like this. Next week when I'm remembering this call, it will make me think, what I should do instead, just because the opportunity to have that conversation. Also listening. Oh my gosh, I love your podcast or radio show and literary podcast, because I love listening to other people's processes and inspirations and seeing how they affect my own.
Well, thank you for that. It's amazing where all of that comes from.
Last break of the podcast. When we come back, Shelley will be talking about how she came to write fiction, how she came to write published fiction. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Still on the search of that one true love? On the limbo in this crazy world of dating, marriage, relationships? Well, listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast, your one-stop podcast for everything about relationships.
Review podcast and my interview with author Shelley Blanton-Stroud. Let's go ahead and return now to that interview.
You started writing fiction 10 years ago. Is it something that you'd always wanted to do, or did it just kind of come out of needing to tell this story?
No, I think before that point, I would have identified myself primarily as a reader. I've always loved to read, and, teaching reading and writing and volunteering at the library and all of that. It was really about the reading. But 10 years ago, it was interesting. My book was published late June this year. And 1 month later was the anniversary of my husband having heart failure 10 years ago. And so it's kind of an interesting roundness there, because 10 years ago, I was getting ready for my book club at Arden Dimick Library, and I got a phone call. Well, my husband and my two sons were off on a scuba diving trip in Monterey Bay. They were going to get, my husband and my youngest son were going to get their, certification for scuba diving. My oldest son already had it. So I get this phone call, I pick it up, and it says Monterey Bay ambulance on it. And I thought, oh my God, which one is it? And I answered the phone, and my older son said, we're okay, but we're in an ambulance. Dad's had heart failure. And so he had it on this scuba diving trip. So I called my library and said, somebody else has got to take over the book club. And I got in the car and drove down there, and he was all right, and he is all right. However, it was at that point 10 years ago in July that we both had a discussion about, if there's anything we want to do, we better get started, because who knows what calamity lies around the corner. And it really was right about a month later that I bought myself a pile of journals, and I started to practice. I started the practice of journaling just to get the feel of writing that wasn't so essay-like and task-oriented as the writing that I do, or the writing that I teach at school. And I started, taking classes and attending workshops and conferences to educate me 10 years ago. And I think it's because, you asked if I was like Jane, and really I'm not. I don't always know what I want. It takes, something happening to clear the rubble and clarify things for me. And it was that happening to my husband that made me think, reading the books isn't entirely enough for me. I want to make my own. And it wasn't even, I want to be published. It was, I want to make a book. I want to make a novel that I would want to read. And so that kind of started the process. I wish I were a little more like Jane and could see more plainly the things I want, but it took something big for me to see it. And so that was right about when, at the point where I'd been leading these book clubs for the library for 10 years, at right about that point, I said, I need to back away from the book club. You'll need to find another facilitator. As much as I loved it, because I was going to try to capture that book club time that had a lot of reading and researching and preparing for our discussions, I was going to try to capture that time for writing. So it was very literal for me, the 10-year thing.
Yeah. So then out of that experience, do you have advice for aspiring authors?
Yeah, when I talk to, sometimes I'll have students at Sac State who, sometimes I'll have students at Sac State who are interested in writing fiction projects. But I'll tell them the first thing is write. Just write. Don't just contemplate writing. Do the writing, because it's similar to people's approach to something like yoga, to set up the practice of making the pen move across the page, even if it's terrible. So I do believe in the practice of what Julia Cameron calls morning pages, where you set apart a time of the day when you promise yourself you will write, even if it's just 20 minutes a day when you can do this. If you save that time for it and say, it can be terrible, it can be anything, but you dedicate yourself to getting words on a page for this amount of time. And then as you get more fluent, what'll happen is you'll become more fluent at it. The words will come more easily with less struggle. And then you can set new challenges for yourself. You can say, I'm going to put a question at the top of these pages. Like in my early journals, I know that they were they were like, oh my gosh, this pile of essays is driving me crazy, and I sure wish dinner was better last night. So, they were very pedantic and just kind of boring. But as I became more fluent, then I would challenge myself with questions like, if there was a family story that seems like it's an origin story, what is it? And then write on that. And I might continue on it for a number of days. And then the writing in the mornings turned into a lot more targeted when I decided I was literally going to write a book and what kind of book it would be. So I definitely think it's okay to start just by writing, even if you don't have a task in mind, even if you can't envision exactly what a project would be, just writing is where to start.
I'm going to imagine that this is going to be a very detailed question or answer from you because you are such a reader, but do you have favorite authors or genres when you read?
I have so many favorites, but I will say that let me just mention a few who relate to this book. How about that? What is her name? Gosh darn it. Oh, I think I've got it now. Okay, I was trying to remember one author's name. So Patricia Highsmith first, who wrote The Talented Mr. Ripley. I loved that book in particular, and it was very inspirational to me because of, there was like, her Ripley was a chameleon, and he was willing and able to change himself into something else to get what he aspired to. And even the tone of The Talented Mr. Ripley sort of got in me and inspired my writing. The fact that things could be sly and you could not be sure exactly how to take it. At the sentence level, Sacramento Joan Didion has always been a goddess to me. I love all of her books, but it's mainly the way she edits her sentences, and they're just, her sentence structure is just ruthlessly clean, and I love it. John Steinbeck, I was inspired a lot by John Steinbeck, mainly in terms of his content, what he chose to look at, and how, for me, it reflected my own area of interest. About writing mystery or thriller well, I just love the contemporary author, Tana French. I mean, I haven't read her new one yet. It's top of the list for now that after retirement on Monday, I'll turn to the new Tana French, because I love what she does with writing mystery, having a really great story, but also making it well told. I really love that combination. That's what means the most to me. There are two others I'd mention. One is Lily, I think it's Lily King, she recently wrote Writers and Lovers, but I loved what she did with her book, Euphoria, which dealt with Margaret Mead. And I love how it was in a historical time, but not dealt with in like a really overtly, preciously, historically sounding. The voices sound very modern, and I really love that. And another person who has a book that was kind of like, I have something called the Mentor Shelf, books that affected my writing of this book. And one of them is Suzanne Rindell, not sure how to pronounce her name. She has a book called The Other Typos, which I loved. It's set in a historic period. I think maybe like 1928 or something, about a woman who goes to work as a typist in a police department and how she starts changing her sense of power and possibility. So that's an intro to some of my reading interests.
I love it. Thank you. I know you have a website, so if you can tell people where they can find your website as well as where they might be able to find you on social media.
Yes. So it's easy enough for my website to go to ShelleyBlanton-Stroud.com. No hyphen, even though my name is hyphenated, the website is ShelleyBlanton-Stroud.com. And I have an author Facebook page as well. And I'm on Instagram and Twitter, all using my name, Blanton-Stroud. It's easy enough to find. I'm not saying I'm going to change your life with my social media posts. That's not the case. But I do like to talk to people in those places. So I'd love to connect with any readers in any of those spots.
All right. I love it. Thank you. We have talked about a lot of different things today, Shelley, but is there anything that we haven't covered that you wanted to mention at this point?
Yes, I think I'll mention that this is a really amazing time in publishing and in reading and in writing. And we still don't know what all is going to happen, but the pandemic has also affected book life. And so one thing I would recommend is that if people could, think about supporting local indie bookstores, they're not just about where you get your books. They are like cultural centers in the places we live. And when you buy your books locally, you're helping people who are your neighbors have a place culturally to go. I know my sort of home bookstore in Sacramento is Capitol Books on K Street, and they've done a great job pivoting to online service at a time like this. I recently heard from a bookseller at Face in a Book. Is that in Folsom or El Dorado Hills? Do you know?
I'm embarrassed to say that I do not know.
Oh, okay. And then the last thing I'll say about that is that there's a new website, fairly new, several months old, called bookshop.org, where you can order your books online very easily and seamlessly, and you can designate an independent bookstore in your town to receive money from that purchase.
And what was that website again?
It's called bookshop.org.
Bookshop. Okay.
Check it out. Yeah, it's very easy to shop there.
Lovely. All right. Well, thank you so much for everything. It was a pleasure speaking with you, and I thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me.
Oh, I loved it.
And once again, thank you so much to Shelley for joining me to talk about Copy Boy. If you're a fan of historical fiction, if you're a fan of books set in the Depression, if you're a fan of coming of age and taking on new identities and reinventing yourself and all of those good things, then you should definitely check out Copy Boy. It is very well crafted and written, and it's just I found it to be an interesting and intriguing story, one that definitely kept me interested and wanting to read until the end. So check out Copy Boy by Shelley Blanton-Stroud. I hope that you will join me next time when I will have a returning author on the podcast. Author Joseph Reed will be back to talk about the third book in his Seth Walker series. So definitely tune in for that, especially if you listen to the first interview or if you have read the first books. You'll want to tune in for this discussion about the third book. Thank you, as always, for taking the time out of your day to listen to book talk and author interviews and learn about new books and maybe new authors that you haven't heard. If, as always, you are a fan of this podcast, I'm going to ask you to do those few simple things that will really help us out. First off, if you'll follow us on social media, excellent. Thank you. GSMC Book Review, GSMC Book Review, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can interact with the podcast. You can ask me questions. You can, just share reading stories. I do love a good reading anecdote, love a good reading meme as well. And then if you'll subscribe to the podcast on whatever podcast platform you listen on, as well as leaving a review, whether that's 5-star or written, either one helps us out and really helps us to get the podcast out to more listeners just like you. Or maybe not just like you, but book lovers, and that's who we're trying to reach. So thank you to Shelley again. Thank you to you, as always, for joining me. Join me again next time when Joseph Reed will be back on the podcast. In the meantime, go out there and get yourself lost in a good book. Thanks.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.